I didn't cry when I signed the divorce papers. Not because I was brave or cold or in denial, but because by the time I stood at that old pine desk in the courthouse, the kind with scratches worn smooth by time and waiting hands, I had nothing left to pour out. The well had been dry for years. The divorce wasn't final yet, not legally. But emotionally we'd long since unraveled. Threads pulled gently at first, then more aggressively, until the tapestry we called a marriage looked more like a memory left out in the sun too long. Faded. Frayed at the corners. My name is Olivia Parker. I'm 51 years old. I own a modest antique store called Olive in Rust on Main Street in a sleepy coastal town in northern Maine, Sambury, population 2,703 on the last census. The kind of place where snowbanks hang around till late April and the ocean wind bites right through your coat. I live alone in the small flat above the shop now. It's quiet, save for the occasional gull, the ticking of the old barometer on the wall, and the occasional creak from the floorboards overhead, though no one ever walks there anymore. Once I wanted to be an illustrator. Children's books, mostly those watercolor dreams with whisper-soft creatures in velvet jackets, wandering through mossy woodlands. I was good too. I still keep a sketchbook behind the register, though the pages are mostly blank these days, except for a few faded pencil starts and half-hearted attempts at foxes. People say I'm reserved. I suppose that's true. I smile, of course. I've always had a warm smile. But no one ever asks about the way my fingers tremble slightly when I tie twine around a fragile parcel. Or the ache that settles in my chest each night when the streetlights come on and the shop is closed and there's no one left to speak to but the shadows in the corners. It was a Tuesday in late October when he walked in. One of those still days where the sea barely moved, and the trees, already stripped bare, clicked against the windows like brittle bones. I'd just finished polishing a collection of brass candlesticks and was kneeling to arrange them on the bottom shelf when the doorbell chimed. He was older than most of my customers, maybe mid-60s. Trim, clean-cut, the kind of man who still buttoned his coat all the way up and wore wool gloves with leather palms. In his hands he held a wooden box. I recognized it instantly. Not the box itself, I'd never seen it before, but the feeling it gave me. Like someone had pressed a forgotten key into my palm and whispered, "Remember." It was no larger than a bread loaf, carved with intricate swirls and flourishes that looked almost Celtic but not quite. The wood was dark, nearly black, with a patina that shimmered when the light hit it just so. "I was told you might know something about this," he said, voice warm but tentative. "I found it in my grandmother's attic, wrapped in linen, tucked behind an old trunk." I reached for it without thinking, my fingertips grazing the grain. It was warm. Too warm. As I lifted the lid, a faint scent, rosewood, perhaps? Or old lavender, rose from within. Inside, a yellowed scrap of paper with a delicate ink drawing of a woman in profile. My heart stopped. I knew that drawing. I'd made it. Years ago. A lifetime ago. He must have seen the color drain from my face. "Are you all right?" I nodded, but my mouth was dry. "I drew this," I whispered. "But I never sold it. I never gave it away." A silence bloomed between us. Not uncomfortable. Just present. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "This belonged to my grandmother. She passed in '97. I didn't have an answer. Only the feeling that something had just cracked open inside me. Something long buried beneath quiet grief and polite conversation. Something like a forgotten version of myself stirring from hibernation. And in that moment, as the early twilight gathered outside and the last of the light slanted through the dusty window pane, I didn't feel like Olivia the shopkeeper. I didn't feel like the woman in the process of becoming someone's ex-wife. I felt like her again. The artist. The dreamer. The woman I had almost forgotten I used to be. I didn't sleep that night. Not in the restless, tossing way of anxiety or regret, but in the quietly electric hum of something waking up. I sat at the small desk beneath the window in my apartment, the same one that looks out over the street lamp and the swaying sign for Olive and Rust, and I sketched. It was the first time in almost 6 years. My fingers were stiff at first, as though I had to convince them I still knew the language of lines and shading, of light falling on the curve of a cheek. But soon the graphite moved on its own, dancing in old rhythms. I drew the box. Then the woman inside the sketch. Then her hand. Then the shadows behind her. The strange thing was I couldn't recall ever drawing her. And yet her face felt like someone I'd loved once. Maybe still loved. By dawn my hands were smudged. My heart full in a way I hadn't let it be in a very long time. The man had left his name Elias. He hadn't stayed long after showing me the box. Just long enough for a cup of tea I'd offered out of habit and politeness, and for a curious conversation that felt strangely unfinished. "I'll be passing through again," he'd said, lifting his scarf. "Maybe I'll stop in." I wanted to tell him yes. Please do. Please come back and bring whatever it was that stirred me awake. But I only smiled, warmly I hope, and nodded like a woman used to not asking for what she wants. The shop was quiet the next few days. A few regulars came in, Mrs. Dorsey from across the street, looking for a new knob for her kitchen cabinet, and Tom, the retired postman, with his usual question about vintage maps. I moved through the motions, polite and present, but inside me a storm had begun. That night, after locking up, I sat at the register and opened the old cash ledger. I tucked the sketch I'd made of the box inside. For some reason it felt right there amid the ink marks and numbers, like she belonged to the bones of this place. Then I did something I hadn't done since my marriage began unraveling. I wrote a letter. Not to anyone. Just to myself. "Olivia, you are not done. You are not dried up or discarded. You are not just a keeper of things that belong to someone else. You belong to yourself." I folded it and slipped it into the pocket of my coat. Maybe it was silly, but sometimes we need reminders even from ourselves. On Friday afternoon, Elias returned. The bell above the door rang and I didn't even have to look up. I knew it was him. That same wool coat, those kind weathered eyes. The scent of the sea still clinging to his collar. "I thought you might," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled. "I owed you a story." We talked for hours that day. I brewed tea Earl Grey with a twist of lemon because it felt like the kind of tea one should drink while discussing fate, and he told me everything he knew. His grandmother, Maureen, had been a painter. Not well known, just local galleries in the 40s and 50s. She lived not far from here in a cabin overlooking the water, and according to Elias she'd been obsessed with capturing a woman she'd once seen in a bookstore, sketching in a corner, hair up in a haphazard knot, utterly unaware of being watched. "I think," he said, "she was trying to paint you." I laughed at first. "That's impossible. I was born in 1972. But then he showed me a photo. His grandmother, holding the box, smiling next to a much younger man. His grandfather. And in the background, tacked to the wall behind them, was a small ink drawing. My drawing. Not the same one that had been inside the box, but close. The lines were identical. My lines. "I have no idea how it got there," I said, voice low. "Does it matter?" he replied. I didn't know what to say. But when he reached across the counter and gently touched the back of my hand, just for a second, I didn't pull away. Because for the first time in years I wasn't just seen. I was felt. I was never the kind of woman who let her heart run ahead of her. Even in college, when the world was full of protests and poetry, I stayed quiet in the back row, sketching my professor's hands instead of raising mine. I kept my feelings like I kept my most fragile antiques. Wrapped carefully in tissue, protected, stored where no one could break them. But after Elias left that Friday, I sat on the floor of my shop long after dark, surrounded by open drawers and unfolded memories. The air was tinged with the smell of old paper and cedar wax, and a single lamp cast golden light across the wood-planked floor. I'd pulled out a box I hadn't touched since the first summer Daniel, my husband, began coming home late. Inside were the remnants of a life I used to believe would be extraordinary. Ink pens worn to the nub. Letters from publishers who liked my style but didn't have room in this season's lineup. A scarf I used to wear when I painted, soft gray with tiny flecks of ochre. and a photo of me standing in front of my first gallery show in Portland, holding a glass of cheap white wine, eyes wide with a hope so naked it made my throat ache. I used to be that woman. Before the miscarriage. Before the business loan we never should have taken. Before Daniel's voice turned careful and his touch turned infrequent. I don't blame him, not entirely. We both let the years collect between us like dust on forgotten shelves. Still, somewhere along the way I'd stopped showing him who I was. And maybe he'd stopped looking. That night I carried my sketchpad to bed. I didn't mean to draw. I just wanted it near me. Like a relic from some earlier version of myself. But as I lay under the quilt, the ocean wind tapping the window pane with soft, persistent fingers, I opened to a blank page. And she came again. The woman from the box. This time I drew her full length, standing barefoot on a rocky shore, her coat open, hair wild in the wind, looking out to sea as though waiting for someone who might not return. There was no model, no photo, no plan. Just memory. Or maybe longing. When I finished, I stared at the drawing for a long while. It didn't feel like a self-portrait. Not exactly. But I realized with quiet certainty, it was who I wanted to become again. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Daniel. His voice was cautious, sleep-laced. Olivia. I'm not calling to argue, I said quickly. Something strange happened this week. There was a pause. A long one. Are you okay? And maybe it was that, the unexpected concern in his voice that cracked something. I sat down on the edge of my bed and told him about the box. About Elias. About the drawing I couldn't remember making. I left out the hand touch, the late-night sketching, the way Elias made me feel seen in a way Daniel hadn't in years. But I told him the truth, that something in me had stirred, and I didn't know what it meant yet. Only that it felt important. He didn't say much at first. I heard the rustle of sheets, the familiar sigh of him pinching the bridge of his nose. I'm glad you called, he said finally. And then quieter, I miss you, Liv. No one had called me Liv in almost a year. Not since the night we stopped sleeping in the same bed. I didn't respond right away. I just let the silence breathe between us like a fragile bridge. Then gently I said, maybe we forgot how to look at each other. Another pause. Maybe we stopped giving each other anything to look at. I didn't know what that meant yet. Not entirely. But I knew I wanted to find out. The next time Elias came into the shop, he brought paint on his hands. It was a Tuesday again, like the first time, and the sky had turned that milky gray that belongs only to November in coastal Maine. The kind of day where the sea disappears into sky and you forget where you end and the world begins. I was adjusting a shelf of vintage music boxes, their delicate porcelain dancers frozen mid-spin, when the doorbell jingled and I looked up. There he was. Wind-flushed cheeks, hair damp with sea air, the cuffs of his sleeves flecked with cobalt and umber. He held a thermos in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. I brought coffee, he said, smiling like we were already old friends. I raised an eyebrow. Bartering with caffeine now? I was hoping it might earn me a story. I smiled, unable to help it. Then you'd better pour. We sat near the bay window, the little round table that had once been a sewing stand now repurposed as a place for quiet company. Outside, the street was still. A few gulls circled lazily above the distant harbor. Inside, the shop felt warmer than usual, maybe because of the coffee or maybe because of him. You paint, I said, nodding toward the smudges on his hands. I do, he replied. Not well, mind you. But enough to ruin a few shirts and a perfectly good rug. I laughed, an actual laugh, the kind that lives in your throat and forgets to be polite. What do you paint? Landscapes. Boats. Sometimes my grandfather's hands. He was a fisherman, gnarled fingers like driftwood, always smelled of brine and diesel. He unfolded the paper he brought. A sketch. My sketch. The woman from the box, redrawn with watercolor, surrounded by a stormy shoreline. My lines beneath his colors. She wouldn't leave me alone, he said softly. I hope you don't mind. I took the paper carefully, my thumb brushing the edge where the paint had bled slightly into the margin. She looks older now. He met my eyes. So do I. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that feels full instead of awkward. A silence that says, I see you and I'll wait. Do you think it's possible, I said finally, for something lost to return in a different form? He tilted his head, considering. I think everything returns. Just not always in the way we expect. I looked down at the painting again. The woman on the cliff was not quite me, but she wasn't a stranger either. She was the version of myself that had learned how to stand in the wind without collapsing. A woman who had loved deeply, hurt quietly, and survived by turning those wounds into art. Elias poured more coffee. His thermos had the initials EW carved into the bottom, and I made a mental note to ask what the W stood for. But instead, I found myself asking something else entirely. Why did you come back here? His eyes didn't flinch. Because something about you felt unfinished. And I don't like leaving things undone. I felt my heart do that small traitorous ache, like a hinge shifting after years of disuse. We didn't touch that day. Not even a brush of fingers. But when he left, I watched him walk all the way to the corner where the street meets the sea. He turned once, as if he knew I'd still be watching, and lifted one hand in a quiet goodbye. Back inside the shop, I locked the door and returned to the watercolor. I ran my fingers along the edge again gently, like it might hum with something just beneath the surface. And then I did something that surprised even me. I pinned it to the wall above my sketch desk. Not to sell. Not to archive. To remember. Because something had shifted. And whether it was the man, the box, or the woman in the wind, I had begun to return to myself. 2 days later, Daniel came to the shop. I heard his truck before I saw it. An old Chevy with a crooked tailgate and tires that crunched too loudly over the frost-laced gravel. It was the truck we used to take on long drives down Route 1, windows down, your hand in mine as the sun dipped below the pines. Before the silence grew between us like ivy, slow and unspoken. He stepped inside without knocking, instinctively ducking under the low bell like he always did, and I felt a memory pull tight in my chest. Hey, he said. His voice hadn't changed. That low, easy rumble that used to soothe me like warm tea. He stood awkwardly near the door, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, unsure if he was welcome. Hey, I answered, careful not to smile too much. He looked around. The shop was different now, less like a business, more like a sanctuary. My drawings had started creeping into the space, pinned up between vintage maps and gilt-framed mirrors. There was a softness in the corners now. A warmth I hadn't realized was missing before. Place looks good, he said. I nodded. It's starting to feel like mine again. A pause stretched between us, long enough to gather meaning. He shifted his weight. You said something the other day about us not seeing each other. About stopping too soon. I've been thinking about that. I crossed my arms not defensively, just to keep the pieces of myself where they belonged. I've been thinking about it too. He nodded slowly. I don't know where we lost it, Liv. But I know I let it go. I stopped asking if you were okay. I stopped noticing when you weren't. His honesty felt like a small flame cupped in trembling hands. And I felt the familiar ache of wanting to forgive, of wanting to fold the past into something manageable. But then I remembered the watercolor. The way Elias looked at me like I was still in the process of becoming, not already defined by what I'd lost. Daniel had loved who I was once. Elias saw who I still might be. I need you to understand something, I said gently. What's waking up in me right now, it's not about you. It's about the part of myself I buried to keep things steady between us. And I'm not sure I want to be steady anymore. He looked stricken but not surprised. I don't want to lose you, he said quietly. You already did. We just didn't notice. His eyes fell to the floor, to the old pine boards that creaked beneath our shared history. I felt no cruelty in the moment, only sadness. The kind that comes from knowing love isn't always enough, not when it's left unattended. But I added after a moment, I don't want to erase you either. I just need to know who I am without being someone's wife. He looked up and I could see it, the part of him that still loved me, not as I am now, but as I once was. And maybe that was the hardest part. I'll give you that, he said. As long as you promise not to disappear completely. I'm trying not to. He turned to leave, hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the counter. A key. To the house we'd once shared. In case you want to come back. Even just to look. And then he was gone. I stood in the quiet after, holding the key in my palm, feeling the cold metal press into the lines of my hand. Behind me, the watercolor shifted slightly on its pin, moved by a draft I hadn't felt. Outside, the sky had begun to snow. Small tentative flakes like things trying to grow even in the cold. The first snow didn't last. By morning it had melted into a thin film of memory on the sidewalks, just enough to remind you that winter was coming whether you were ready or not. I opened the shop early, craving the soft hum of the radiator, the comfort of ritual. I swept the front steps. I lit the little fig-scented candle near the register. I played Ella Fitzgerald low on the old radio tucked beside the velvet fainting couch. And then around 10, Elias returned. This time he carried a small canvas wrapped in brown paper, the corners frayed and soft. His cheeks were pink from the wind, and he smelled faintly of salt and something like pine sap. He didn't speak at first. Just set the package down on the counter like something sacred. You'll think I'm crazy, he said, but I think the box was meant for you. I looked up slowly. What do you mean? He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers stained faintly with ochre. I was sorting through my grandmother's attic again. I found an envelope tucked inside an old dictionary. It had your name on it. My chest went still. That's not possible. I know. But it's in her handwriting. It just says for Olivia. She'll know what it means. He pulled the envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to me like it might shatter. I turned it over, thick, cream-colored, the kind of stationery no one uses anymore. And there in looping blue ink was my name. Not Mrs. Parker. Not Liv. But Olivia. My full name written with care. Reverence. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a pressed flower, Queen Anne's lace, brown with age, and a single sentence written in that same looping script. Beauty once buried can bloom again if the soil is soft enough. I stared at it for a long time. And then I cried. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to, not in front of him. But the tears came anyway, quiet and complete, sliding down my cheeks like something sacred was being returned to me. Elias didn't say a word. He just stood beside me, not touching, not intruding, just present. A witness. When I finally caught my breath, I whispered, "How could she have known me?" He shrugged, voice soft. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she just hoped you'd find yourself again. And maybe that was it. Maybe this wasn't about logic or timelines or bloodlines at all. Maybe some women, across generations, across places, simply recognized the ache in one another. The ache of quiet, creative souls who set themselves aside for other people's comfort. Maybe Maureen had seen that in me. Maybe she knew what I didn't yet, that I was worth finding again. Elias gently slid the wrapped canvas toward me. Open it. I did. And there she was again. The woman I'd drawn, the one he painted over my lines. Only now she was standing with her arms outstretched, wind in her hair, the sea behind her churning with light. Her face was turned up, eyes closed, as though receiving something she didn't think she deserved but was accepting anyway. She's you, he said quietly. I don't know if I believe that. I do. I looked at him then, really looked. And what I saw in his face wasn't infatuation. It wasn't romance. It was reverence. Recognition. The kind of gaze that says, I see who you are. Even the parts you've forgotten. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Gulls wheeled overhead. The tide was beginning to come in. I want to take you somewhere, Elias said. Where? He smiled. To the place where the box was found. I hesitated. But only for a moment. Give me 5 minutes. I locked the shop. I changed into my coat, my old boots. I slipped the envelope into my pocket. And as I followed him out into the wind and salt and early winter sky, I felt something unfurl in my chest. Not a decision. Not yet. But a beginning. And beginnings are everything. The road to the house was narrow, the kind that seemed stitched together by roots and memory rather than pavement. Pines leaned in close, their trunks silver with old lichen, their needles whispering above us like gossiping women. I hadn't been this far outside town in years. The air was different here, cleaner, lonelier. We didn't talk much on the drive. Elias let the silence rest between us like a blanket, and I was grateful for it. I watched the trees pass, flickering like memories, and wondered if this was what it felt like to drift toward the past without fear. The house appeared like something from a forgotten painting. White clapboard peeling, a slanted porch, shutters hanging by rusted hinges. But there was a softness to it too. Like even time had chosen to move gently here. It stood at the edge of a bluff, just beyond a cluster of wind-tossed birch trees. And beyond that, water. Endless, gray-blue, the kind that looked like it had no bottom. She lived here? I asked. He nodded. For almost 50 years. Alone mostly. I stepped onto the porch, the wood soft beneath my boots. The door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the house was a hush of dust and shadows. Light filtered through gauzy curtains. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, and under that linseed oil. The unmistakable scent of paint. She painted here? I whispered, though I already knew. Every day. We moved through the rooms slowly. There were no signs of life, only echoes, a teacup left on a windowsill. A piano with yellowed keys. A rust-colored shawl draped over the back of a faded armchair. And then in the room at the back of the house we found it, the studio. The walls were covered in canvases. Not hung, but leaned against the plaster, some stacked in corners, others facing inward, as though their secrets weren't meant for everyone. A few were covered in sheets. One had clearly been started and abandoned, brush strokes frozen mid-motion. And in the center of the room, the same box. The twin to the one he'd brought me. Only this one was cracked open, empty inside, as though it had given all it had to give. I felt a tug in my chest. Familiar and unnameable. Elias crossed the room and lifted a cloth from a canvas. Beneath it was a painting, unfinished, but undeniably mine. Not of me, but from me. My style, my marks, my hands. I don't remember painting this, I said. You didn't, he replied. She did. But it didn't make sense. The brush strokes mimicked mine exactly. My old signature, a looping O, a tiny fox in the curve of the P, was scrawled in the bottom corner. I touched it. The paint was real. The texture. The scent. How? He looked at me, serious now. I think she dreamed you. Or maybe you dreamed her. Either way, I don't think you're here by accident. I stood still for a long time, the kind of stillness that sinks into the bones. The light through the window fell on the floor like spilled milk, and for a second I imagined Maureen here, alone in the wind and paint and salt air, painting a woman she'd never met but somehow knew would one day need to find herself again. She was trying to give something back to me, I said. Elias stepped closer. Or maybe she was holding it for you until you were ready to come and take it. We stood in that room, surrounded by silence and ghosts and color. And I felt it again, that old ache. Not pain. Not grief. Longing. But this time it didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something coming home. That night I didn't go back to the apartment above the shop. I didn't go back to the neat shelves, the quiet humming radiator, the bed with only one side disturbed. I stayed. Elias had a small cabin not far from Maureen's house, tucked just off the gravel road like it was trying not to be seen. He offered it without pressure. There's an old stove and hot water, he'd said. And the stars here, if the clouds ever part, they'll make you forget you're made of gravity. I hadn't packed anything. I had no toothbrush, no pajamas, not even a book to pretend I brought for company. Just the clothes I'd worn to the shop, my coat, and the envelope Maureen had left for me, folded soft now at the edges from being handled too many times. But I stayed. The cabin was simple. Bare wood walls, a cot near the fireplace, and a window that looked out over a field gone to rust and dry wild grass. Elias lit the fire while I stood at the window and watched the sky turn the color of ash. I can leave you alone, he said gently after the fire had caught. If that's what you need. But I shook my head. Not alone. Just quiet. We shared a dinner of soup and bread he'd brought both from town, wrapped in dish towels and smelling faintly of rosemary and butter. I didn't speak much, and he didn't press. He moved like someone used to solitude, the kind of man who knew when silence was sacred and when it was avoidance. Later, I sat curled beneath a wool blanket while he read by the fire, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose, the book balanced in one steady hand. I didn't ask what he was reading. I just watched the way the firelight touched his face, the small smile he wore when a line pleased him. "Do you think people can start over?" I asked suddenly. He didn't look up. Just turned a page. "I think starting over's a myth." My heart stilled, a little hurt. But then he looked at me and said, "I think people start again. With all their old parts. Nothing discarded. Just reassembled." I breathed in slowly. The room felt warm in a different way. "I wasn't unhappy every day," I whispered, more to the fire than to him. "With Daniel. I wasn't miserable. I just went quiet inside. For years. Until I didn't even know how to speak to myself anymore." Elias closed the book gently and set it aside. He didn't say "I'm sorry," which I appreciated. He didn't try to fix it. He just looked at me, really looked, like he always did. "Sometimes," he said, "quiet is a kind of rebellion. A soft one. The kind that waits. Watches. And then if you're lucky it wakes up." A pause stretched between us. Long safe. Then I did something unexpected. I got up, walked over to him, and reached for his paint-stained hand. It was warm. Solid. Real. "I don't know what this is," I said. "I don't know where it's going. I'm not asking for anything." He nodded, his voice low. "Neither am I." We stood like that for a moment. Not in an embrace, not even in a closeness that demanded explanation. Just in something honest. Something still forming. Later, when the fire burned down and the wind rose outside, I crawled into the cot alone, wrapped in borrowed blankets. He stayed by the hearth reading again, guarding the room like a lighthouse. And I fell asleep not with clarity, not with resolution, but with peace. And for the first time in years, I dreamed not of what I'd lost, but of what I might build. I returned home just as the snow began to fall again, soft, hesitant flakes spiraling past the windshield like they hadn't quite made up their minds. The kind of snow that feels more like a hush than a storm. The kind that covers everything without asking permission. It had been 4 days since I'd left the shop. 4 days since I'd stepped into Maureen's house and found myself tangled in a story I didn't know I was a part of. 4 days of slow mornings, shared silence, painting again in the cold light of Elias's cabin. I had taken over the corner of his kitchen table, paper curled beneath a jam jar of brushes, colors blooming quietly beneath my fingers. I painted the sea. I painted the box. I painted her again, the woman who now felt less like a character and more like a map back to myself. But the world waits. Bills arrive. Customers call. And there was Daniel. When I turned the key to the shop's front door and stepped inside, the stillness greeted me like an old friend. Everything was as I'd left it, dust just slightly thicker, the candle a stub of wax now, the sketch on the wall quietly watching. But something had shifted in me. I was no longer just a caretaker of forgotten things. I was a woman who had been forgotten and who had chosen, deliberately, to remember herself. By afternoon, I was halfway through restocking a glass cabinet with vintage brooches when I heard the door open. I knew the sound of his boots before I looked up. Daniel. He looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. He was wearing the navy wool coat I'd bought him 3 Christmases ago, the one with the tear at the pocket he'd never bothered to fix. "I brought your gloves," he said, holding them out like a peace offering. They were in the old drawer by the sink. I took them gently. "Thank you." He stood there, shifting slightly, the silence between us thick with unsaid things. "I didn't know if you were coming back," he said. "I didn't either." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about all the ways I stopped seeing you. How I let everything get so quiet between us that I didn't notice how far away you'd gotten." I swallowed. My heart wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. Just tired. "I think we both stopped looking," I said. He sighed, rubbed his palms together. "I'm not here to convince you. I found the part of me I left behind," I interrupted, voice quiet. "And I'm not willing to lose her again." His shoulders fell slightly, but his eyes didn't. "I'm proud of you," he said, surprising me. "I've seen your drawings. The ones you've started hanging in the window. They're beautiful, Liv. Something in me softened. I never stopped loving you, I admitted. But love isn't enough when you forget to see each other. I needed something to shake me awake. And did it? He asked. I thought of Elias. Of his quiet steadiness. His patient eyes. His belief in me when I had none. But this wasn't about choosing between two men. This was about choosing me. It did, I said. Daniel looked down, then up again. I'd like to try. Even if it's slow. Even if it's messy. I watched him, my old partner in a life we had both let drift. And in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not the wild kind. The gentle kind. Like snow that falls just warm enough to melt. Like forgiveness spoken not with words, but with presence. Like beginning again, not from scratch, but from truth. I don't know if we'll make it, I said softly. But I'd like to find out. As long as I don't have to disappear to do it. His eyes shone. You won't. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and steady. Inside, two people stood in the middle of a little antique shop, not reconciled, not healed. But willing. And sometimes that's where everything begins. We didn't fall back into our life, we walked toward it. Slowly. Carefully. As though it were something fragile and long buried, like a sea glass bottle that had surfaced after decades underwater, still intact but smoothed by the tides. Daniel came by the shop most afternoons. Not to hover or reclaim, but just to be near, to relearn the contours of the version of me he'd forgotten. Sometimes he helped me restock the shelves, his large hands oddly gentle with the delicate lace gloves and porcelain birds. Other times he sat with a paper cup of coffee, watching quietly as I drew, never interrupting, only offering the occasional, quiet truth. That one looks like you when you used to wake up early to paint before breakfast. We didn't talk about Elias. Not directly. But one day Daniel stood at the counter, turning the watercolor of the woman by the sea over in his hands. I watched him for a long moment before I said, he reminded me I was still a woman. Not just a wife, or a shopkeeper, or someone waiting to be needed again. He nodded slowly. I understand. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just a tenderness I hadn't heard in years. Did you love him? He asked. I didn't need to, I said. He woke something in me. That was the gift. Not the man. The mirror. Daniel didn't press. And in that silence I felt something sacred pass between us. Not permission. Not forgetting. But understanding. Winter rolled in soft and deep that year. Snow gathered in the corners of the windows, blanketed the rusted cars in the lot behind the shop, and turned the sidewalks into a kind of hush. Business slowed, but I didn't mind. I spent mornings painting by the front window, the space warmed by the hiss of the radiator and the scent of cinnamon steeping in my tea. And then, one afternoon near the year's end, something unexpected happened. A woman, young, early 20s maybe, stepped into the shop, cradling a worn box in her hands. I don't know if you're the right place for this, she said, but it was in my grandmother's attic. It felt like it should belong somewhere, safe. She set it on the counter, and my breath caught. It wasn't identical to the first box. Smaller, carved in a slightly different hand. But the feeling, it was the same. That unmistakable hum of memory stirring beneath the surface. Like being handed a thread in the dark. Do you know who made it? I asked. She shook her head. No idea. But when I opened it, there was a drawing inside. A woman by the water. Holding a key. I stared at her. Would you mind if I kept it? I asked gently. She smiled. I was hoping you would. After she left, I carried the box upstairs and sat at my desk where my paints waited. Outside, snow dusted the windows like powdered sugar. I opened the lid carefully and removed the drawing. It wasn't mine. And yet somehow it was. The lines were different, looser, more rushed. But the woman in the drawing was me. Not exactly. Older. Wiser. Wearing a look I'd only just begun to recognize in the mirror. Peace. A second gift. A quiet answer. I pressed the drawing to my chest and let the moment settle. Later that night, Daniel met me at the apartment. We cooked dinner together, spaghetti, clumsy and perfect. He spilled sauce on his shirt and didn't swear. I sang quietly under my breath as I chopped garlic. When we sat down to eat, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For coming back." I smiled. "I didn't come back," I said. "I came forward." And we both understood the difference. The watercolor still hangs above my desk. Some mornings I catch myself looking at it like a memory of someone I once knew intimately. Someone who saved me by reminding me I was never truly gone. And the boxes still find their way to me now and then. From strangers, from attics, from places where old stories sleep. I keep them all. Not because they're valuable, but because they remind me that beauty buried is not beauty lost. That love can survive silence if tended. And that a woman, no matter her age, can return to herself again, and again, and again, and again.